If someone said to you, "Who is Jesus?" how would you describe him? Could you think of 3 words now to describe Jesus? Jesus is this, this, and this. I wonder what would be in your list of 3. Who is Jesus? Did the word revolutionary get in your list? Maybe, maybe not. In seeking to punish and get rid of the Jesus problem, as the Jewish leaders saw it, they accuse Jesus, the Son of God, of usurping power, of stirring up, of being a revolutionary. You know when something is serious when you see who it is who is asking the questions, who perhaps is involved in the interview room. Perhaps you remember the chairs outside the head's office at primary school and how serious something had to be if you were going to be sent there. In Luke 22 and 23, we see Jesus being asked questions, and these are not simple inquiries from interested potential disciples, but by religious and political leaders, seeking to manage a situation and remain with as much authority, or at least perceived authority, as they can muster. In Luke's account, Jesus is tried by the council, by Pilate, by Herod, and by the crowd. Look at verse 66 of chapter 22. Jesus is led, he is formally brought before the council. I don't know what is the biggest interview panel you've ever faced. I once faced a panel of 10, and I remember vividly my viva for my master's degree, faced with 5 examiners, all in academic dress and looking relatively stern. The council, the Sanhedrin, had 71 members. Sadducees, Pharisees, the middle-class laymen, the elders of the time. And this group, led by the high priest, formed a semicircle around the accused to examine them. And by this point, Jesus has already been beaten by the temple police and mocked. What is the question of this council in verse 67? If you are the Messiah, tell us. The investigation is this man claiming to be the anointed one of God? Does he really set himself up as greater than the gathered learning and status of this room? As Joel Green puts it, they are asking who interprets the will and purposes of God correctly, who legitimately exercises the authority of God, who will rule the people of God. The council are already certain Jesus must die, but they need a charge. When Jesus has predicted his death and resurrection earlier in Luke chapter 9, verse 22, he also predicts the rejection of this very group of people. The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and he must be killed, and on the 3rd day be raised to life. In this trial, Jesus essentially says, if I answer and say I am the Messiah, you won't believe me. If I enter into dialogue with you, well, there's no point, because you have already made up your minds against me. But then Jesus does speak in verse 69. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God. At this present moment, the council sit in judgment over Jesus. But from now on, Jesus will be at the right hand of God, the ruler and judge. For this council, Jesus, speaking of his identity as the Son of Man, is probably ringing bells for them about the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, and speaking of his position at the right hand of the power of God is enough for them to find him guilty. But then notice the emphasis change as we move to a Roman trial in chapter 3, verses 1 to 5, as Jesus is brought before Pilate. Well, why have they brought Jesus to Pilate? The Romans were the only ones who were allowed to dispense capital punishment, and therefore the trajectory that they are aiming at is to present Jesus as a revolutionary who challenges Roman authority and therefore must die. Michael Card points out that more than any other gospel writer, Luke focuses on Jesus' innocence. In this first meeting with Jesus, Pilate shows little enthusiasm for a long trial, or really much of the matter at all. The charges the council make against him now include political uprising in verse 2. We have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Messiah, a king. Amazingly, these charges are to suggest that Jesus is a dangerous false prophet, one who disturbs the nation. And as he leads people astray, surely this will lead to trouble for the Romans. There will be a disturbance of the Pax Romana. Whilst Jesus hasn't been stirring up the people against the authorities, and certainly hasn't suggested people shouldn't pay their taxes to Caesar, he has spoken of his kingdom. And to say that Jesus is Lord is to say that Caesar is not. But Pilate is not concerned. The Jesus before him does not scream threat, so he declares him innocent. He looks at Jesus, perhaps in Green's phrase, a harmless eccentric. Surely the man in front of him can't be the leader, the one who rules God's people. But the council are committed to their cause, and they plead with urgency. And the mention of Galilee brings up an opportunity for Pilate to pass the buck. So in verses 6 to 12, Jesus is sent to Herod. This questioning, these repeated allegations are met with silence. Fulfilling Isaiah's prophecy from Isaiah 53, he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a sheep to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. Herod is pleased to be given the opportunity to see Jesus, not because he is interested in following him, but because he wants to see a miracle. He's obviously heard stories about Jesus' ministry. But the council continues to accuse. But Herod doesn't find him guilty. Herod doesn't recognize the king before him, so he mocks him. Now, there is a dress code for being a king, and Jesus didn't fit it. I don't know whether you've ever had the experience of turning up for an event or a party, not really being aware of the dress code, and feeling either very over or very underdressed. I commend to you my motto that it is always better to be overdressed than underdressed. Herod returns to Jesus to Pilate dressed like a king in verse 11, as he seeks to mock him. So far in the trials before Pilate and Herod, Jesus has not been found guilty. Yet the march towards a death penalty is unrelenting. Pilate suggests some punishment, and then he will release Jesus. But the cry of the mob arises, "Away with this man." And the shouts and the demands in verses 18, 21, and 23. This interrupts this sense of due process and trial, of legal precedent, of what is right or what is true. In the face of the crowd, Pilate restates his belief that Jesus is innocent. But his conviction is not enough to challenge the mob rule and risk unrest. Nothing less than death will satisfy the council and the crowd. The chief priests, the leaders, perhaps those paid or bribed to shout. Together they speak. They believe that they are acting in God's ways. Their hard hearts towards Jesus are made harder by God. They send Jesus on the road to real rescue, and where we see our true servant king. But what do these events say to us today? There are at least three things that we can be challenged to think about this morning: Jesus' identity, those on trial, and the shout of the crowd. Jesus' identity, we can look but not see. You see, Jesus is asked questions about his identity. He is accused of being things. Yet from those asking those questions, there is a real unwillingness to believe. Have we already quickly decided who Jesus is? Have we the humility to go back to the Bible and ask the Holy Spirit to open our eyes as we read the Bible together, as we've been asking and looking at in Luke's Gospel this week, Sunday by Sunday? Are you open to recognize the Jesus who walks off the pages of the Bible? Too often we pick the Jesus that we want to believe in, rather than seeking right answers, real answers. In an article for Psychology Today, William Berry of the Florida International University writes this: "We do not see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. We do not see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. And on our own, we cannot see Jesus as he is. Rather, we see the Jesus that we want to see." The cartoonist Adam 4D reflects that there are lots of constructed Jesuses in our world today that we make to fit our ideas about politics or success or self-worth. And he says that all these Jesuses have two things in common. One, people believe them, and two, they don't exist. As we approach Easter, we need to be those who recognize the only Son of God, and we need the help of God's Spirit to do that. A helpful question through this series of sermons looking at Luke's Gospel is, what does this passage tell us about Jesus? And if that is true, what do I need to do? The focus of looking at this book together is not to accumulate more knowledge about Jesus, but to get to know Jesus, to deepen our relationship with him. So where are you learning about Jesus' identity? Will you take time this week on your own with us here as we gather for Holy Week reflections, for communion on Thursday evening, and for the hour at the cross on Friday afternoon? Then those on trial today. There are many places where Christians face detention without trial, or trials with false charges, or mob violence, particularly in those places on the Open Doors watch list, which you can see highlighted on the screen. Places like Pakistan, where in June last year a 73-year-old Pakistani Christian called Lazar was brutally beaten to death by a mob after being falsely accused of burning a copy of the Quran. Or in Iran, where the three people on the screen were just handed prison sentences just last month. Nargiz Nazri, age 37, who is pregnant with her first child, pictured in the center of the screen, has been sentenced to 16 years imprisonment. This comprises 10 years for propaganda activities contrary to Islamic law, 5 years for house church involvement, and 1 year for social media posts supporting the women life freedom movement that emerged following the death of Masha Amina for improper wearing of the hijab. Will you pray to the one who was put on trial, as we've just heard in Luke's Gospel, for Najaz, her family, and all who face similar persecutions? Perhaps you want to sign up to learn more, to receive information for Open Doors, who visited us last year, to be able to pray, to write, to campaign. And lastly, that the loudest voices are not always necessarily right. This is a challenge for us. Just because the newspapers that we read, or the podcasts that we listen to, or all our friends in the WI, or at five-a-side, or at the school gate say the same thing, just because it's trending on Twitter doesn't mean it's right, or God's opinion. And in this I include those who would adopt the language of faith and the idea of a Christian nation to promote the hatred of others. The voices against God and his ways in our world are strong, as they were in these words in Luke's Gospel. They are at times more subtle than others, but the message that is repeated again and again is that God doesn't really exist, or that we can't be sure, or that religion is just man-made, or that all religions are essentially the same, and what is important is living life to the full. So who are you listening to? Can you hear, even in his silence in parts of this passage, Jesus' identity as the only one good enough to pay the price of sin and death, the only one worth following, the one who promises us new life, not just great experiences now, but everlasting joy in a new creation. In John chapter 8, Jesus does say that the truth will set you free. And those words that are often quoted, but as with most quotations, knowing what comes around it can be unbelievably helpful. In John 8:31, Jesus is speaking to those who have believed in him, and he says to them, "If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." As former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, writes in his book, Christ on Trial, if listening to the words and acts of Jesus becomes the environment in which you live, you will discover the freedom to be drawn ever deeper into truth. So may you find Jesus, the Son of God, Son of Man, King, the guiltless one, the source of your identity as a child and heir of God. May you find true freedom in him, that you might follow him and serve him all your days. Amen.